This morning's Daf Yomi is Kesubos, Mem Aleph, Kesubos 41, and we are at the Mishnah on the top of the page. The Mishnah tells us as following: HaOmer PCC Esbito Shalponi. Somebody comes forward and says, I admit that I seduced the daughter of so-and-so, Mishalim Boshes Upagam Al Piatzmo, on the basis of his own admission. He has to pay the humiliation cost and the depreciation cost from the damage that he inflicted, and he pays that on the basis of his own admission. Ve'ein mishalim kinas. However, on the basis of his own admission, he does not pay the kinas, the punitive damage, the fine. This is the law of modeh b'kinas is pater. That one who admits to a fine, he admits that he did something wrong, which typically would come along with a fine, since he admits to the fine. Therefore, we say he is patur, he is exempt from having to pay the fine. So therefore, somebody admits to seducing a girl, and therefore, even though he has to pay as a result of his admission, the compensatory damages of the humiliation and depreciation, he does not pay the 50 shekel kanas. So too, the Mishnah says, HaOmer ganavti, a person says, I stole money. Then we say, yes, because you stole something, Mishayim as a Karen, you pay the principal, the compensatory damages, al piatz, on the basis of his own admission. Ve'ein mishalim tashlumei kefel, tashlumei arba v'chamisha. But we don't have him pay the kanas. In this case, it would be either the double penalty, the double payment, or if he stole a sheep or ox and then slaughtered or sold it, it would be 4 or 5 times the amount. He's not going to pay that on his own admission. Let's say a person says, Hamis shori es ploni or shorosh ploni. So let's say a person says, my ox killed someone, or he killed this other person's ox. Then he has to pay the kofar, the ransom, on the basis of his own admission. And this is a dispute in Baba Kama. Do we say the kofar payment is memona or kapara? Do we say it is a kapara, an atonement, in which case it's a knas? Or do we say it's memona, it's compensatory, in which case he would have to pay? So that's why our Mishnah says it is memona, it's compensatory, therefore he has to pay. Let's say he says, Hamis shori avdo shalponi. Let's say he says, my ox killed this eved, this slave, where we know the Torah says if somebody's ox kills a slave, you pay 30 shekel. So in this case, he will not pay it, because that's a kanas, that's a penalty. So he will not pay it on the basis of his own admission. And says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, the general rule is, whoever ends up paying more than the damages that he actually did, will not pay it on his own, because that's a kinas. A kinas is a fine where you pay more than the compensatory damages. That's what our Mishnah says. So the Gemara says, first of all, let's go back to the first clause of the Mishnah. Why did it say one who seduced his daughter? One who comes forward and says, I seduced this man's daughter. Why does it give that example? It should not have used the example of one who seduced another man's daughter. It could have used the example of one who comes forward and says, I assaulted another man's daughter. Under those circumstances, he still pays the humiliation and depreciation, but he does not pay the kanas. And Tosfos explains the question that it would be a bigger chiddush, it would be a better teaching, a sharper teaching, to tell us that he's exempt from the kanas under those circumstances, because he's admitting he did a worse act, because it is worse to assault than to seduce. So it should have said, V'lisnei anasti. The Gemara says, lo mibai kamar. No, our Mishnah is what's called a lo mibai Mishnah, meaning to say it gives the bigger chiddush. The bigger chiddush is not on nasti, but the bigger chiddush is that he's exempt. He's exempt in the case of PCC, because we're not focusing on the fact that he's exempt. We're actually focusing on what he is liable for. as the Gemara is about to explain. Lo mi bay kamar, lo mi bay anas. Not only in a case where he says, I assaulted her, deloka pagimla, there he really is not causing damage to her reputation. So it's not a case of seduction where she was a willing participant. So the damage to her reputation, ironically, in the case of assault, is less. So the loka pagamas, and not only in that case, the mishalim bosha supagam al piatzmo. There he has to pay humiliation, depreciation on the basis of his own admission, because not only in a case of assault where he's not, by paying the humiliation, depreciation, he's not ruining her reputation of PCC, but in a case where he seduced her, where if he pays the humiliation, depreciation, the kapagimla, he's actually affecting her, because there's going to be a as Rashi says, there's going to be a scuttlebutt. The gossip will be that this woman was involved in this consensual relationship. So we might have thought that therefore he doesn't pay the humiliation, depreciation on the basis of his own admission, because it's actually hurting her worse. And we say, no, that's not the case. That we say, according to the Tanakh of our Mishnah, that he still pays if he comes forward and says he did this. We require him to pay the compensatory damages. But Bob points out the Gemara Masnisin, our Mishnah, the Lokiaitan, our Mishnah, which says that he pays the humiliation and depreciation on the basis of his own testimony, based on his own admission, is not like the following brisa, Titania, because we're going to the brisa. Rabbi Shimon Yehuda, Omer Mishim Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Yehuda taught in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Af Boshes Upagam, Eino Mishayim Al Piyaso. Rabbi Shimon Yehuda taught in the name of Rabbi Shimon that he also pays the humiliation and depreciation. Af Boshes Upagam, also the humiliation and depreciation, he does not pay. Eino Mishayim Al Piyaso. He does not pay on the basis of his own admission, because, like we said, when he pays the humiliation and depreciation in a case of seduction, he's actually hurting the girl. We're not going to necessarily believe him and take his money, and as a result of that, he's actually ruining the reputation of the girl. So Rav Papa Abaye, so Rav Papa says to Abaye, let's say she says, I don't mind the ruin to my reputation. I'd rather have the money that comes along with being humiliated and depreciated. I'd rather take my money. There, what do we say? So Gemara says, no, that's not an option for her, because maybe it's not going to be good for her father. Maybe her father is not going to appreciate this circumstance where her reputation is ruined. So maybe the father wouldn't like it. And let's say the father says, you know what? I don't mind one bit. So there, what do we say? Let's say he wants the money. Gemara says, again, we're not going to allow it. Because maybe the family members are not going to like it. So maybe they don't want to have the reputation attacked. Gemara says, well, let's say the family members say, we don't mind. The Gemara says, no. It's impossible that there isn't one family member somewhere that would object to this. So we see from here that what the Gemara is telling us is that this is not a law, that even though we presented it as a subjective law, but it's not really subjective. The idea that the girl would say, actually, I prefer the money to saying they don't want to embarrass me, I prefer getting the money. No, we don't allow you to say that, because we say that overwhelming majority of cases is not like that, and so therefore we don't allow the girl to say that. So it says the Gemara, Omer Gonavti Mishai Masakarin. Let's say it said in the Mishnah, if a person said, I stole, we make him pay the penalty. Gemara now transforms and goes from a Kesubos sugya straight into a Baba Kama sugya, and because in the end the Gemara is going to try and bring a proof to this discussion in Baba Kama from our Mishnah in Kesubos. And the case in Baba Kama is a discussion of the payment of half damages of palga, niska, of half damages, that there's a big dispute. How do we look at the fact if an ox that is a tam ox scores versus an ox that is a muad ox scores? If it's an ox that's a tam, that the ox has never gored before, or if it's a muad where it's gored in the past, and therefore we have the expectation that it's going to gore again in the future. So the tam ox pays half damages for the goring that it does, whereas the muad pays full damages. So that's one difference. There's other differences as the Gemara is going to point out. But how do we view these half damages? Do we view it as the fact that it's just half the compensatory payment, it's just memona, or do we say it's actually a fine? It really owes nothing and it's a fine. So that's the dispute here. Itmar palga niska. How do we view these half damages? Again, a clear distinction would be, let's say you come forward on your own and admit it. So if it's a fine, then you're liable for nothing. But if it's memona, then you'd have to pay. So palga niska, how do we view it? Rav Papa says palga niska is memona. Rav Papa says it's compensatory. It's not a kanas. Whereas Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua says palga niska is a kanasa. It's a kanas. Rav Papa says palga niska, these half damages that the shuratam pays, is memona. He says it is compensatory. Why? Because Kasavar is of the opinion, stam shvarim lav b'cheskas shimor kam. He says most oxen, we don't assume that they're properly guarded. So really, you should have to pay the full damages for the damage that your ox does. The Torah is the one who has mercy upon you, but really you owe the full amount, and the Torah is just having mercy upon you. Because your ox has not yet become a muad, your ox is not yet gored in the past. Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua, he says palga niska is a kanasa. He says Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua says no, the half damage is a kanas. It's a fine, and Kasavar, he's at the position. Stam shvarim b'cheskas shimor kaimi. He says most of the oxen we could assume that they are really actually watched. Ubedinu du olishalim klal, and so therefore you really shouldn't have to pay anything because we could have the baseline assumption that your ox is not going to gore. V'rachmana hu dekanse. The Torah is the one who finds you kiyeche denintere l'surei. So you should do an even better protection on the ox. And so that's how we get to this fundamental dispute. How do we look at palga niska? Is it memona like Rav Papa, or is it kanasa like Rav Huna, B'Reid Rav Yeshua? So the Gemara is going to try and prove this case. So the Gemara says, Simon, there's three attempts, hezek, ma, vehimis, klal. So Tanan, hanizak v'mazik b'tashlumin. So how do we prove this case? It says, there's a Mishnah in Baba Kama which states the Nizak and the Mazik share in the Tashlumin. The Nizak is the damaged party and the Mazik is the damager. They both share in the payments. So how do we understand this Mishnah? Bishlam Laman Amar Palga Niska Memona makes sense according to Rav Papa, who says half damages are monetary. Well, that makes perfect sense. That to say that the Nizak shares in the payments, because why do we say it makes sense? Because how else do we explain why the Nizak is paying? Because he's really entitled to everything. So that's why it makes sense to say this Mishnah. I know the Shach Nizak b'tashlumin. But according to Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua, says the half damages are really a kanas, and so therefore the Nizak is really entitled to nothing. But the Torah is just giving him a bonus, giving him the half damages. Hashta do avdi deika shakal. Well, now, so b'tashlumin, how is he in tashlumin? How is he making up the payment? He's taking money that's not even his. He's getting a windfall. He really should have lost everything, and the Torah is giving him a bonus. So why is it saying in the Mishnah that the nizak is in the tashlumin? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you how. No, the nizak is joining in because he has to pay the tachas navela, the depreciation of the carcass. And once the animal is killed, it automatically, the carcass is owned by the damaged party. And so therefore it depreciates. The loss is borne entirely by the damaged party. And so therefore, that's why we say that he is also paying for the tashlumin. So the Gemara says, Pachas Navela Tanina. But Pachas Navela, we already learned this law that the Nizak is paying for the damaged, the Nizak's responsible for the carcass. Because it says Tashlume Nezak. What do we learn from the statement of the payments of the damaged? That we learned from here that the owner has to, the owner of the original owner of the deceased ox has to get involved with the carcass. So why are we saying here this principle that, why are we saying here this principle is referring to Pachas Navela when we have an open Mishnah that already taught us that? So the Gemara says, well, we need both sources. One is talking about the Pachas Navela of the Tam, that belongs to the Nizak, and one is talking about the Pachas Navela of a muad that also belongs of an animal that's scored by a muad that also belongs to the nizak. Utsricha. We need both cases. Diashmin and tam. If we just learned the case of the tam mishum dakati lo iyad, we would say that that's the reason why. If we just had the case of the tam, I would say because what's the reason why the nizak has to pay for the pachas navela there? Because the akati lo iyad. That what's the reason why it's his loss? Because the axe that gored was not yet a shor muad of a muad. But if it was a case of a muad ox that gored, the yayid that it's the one that gored, and since we already say it's already been a muad, it's already gored in the past. Amalo, I might say that the nizak is not responsible for the pachas navela. The ashmina muad, and if we had the case of the muad, I would say that that's what's the reason why he has to pay for the Pakas and the Vela. Mishum to come Sham Kue. I might have said the reason why the Nizak has to absorb the cost of the Pakas and the Vela is because the owner of the Muad has already paid for everything of a Tam, but the owner of the Tam is only paid half. I might have said he's not responsible for the Pakas and the Vela, so it's Richa. That's why you need both cases. Tashma, so the Gemara is going to bring another proof to prove whether or not Halganiska is Mimona or Kinasa. Tashma, we learned also in Baba Kama, Ma bein Tam Muad. What's the distinction between a Tam and a Muad? Shatam Meshai Chatzi Nezek Migufo, Muad Meshayim Nezek Shalom Min Aliyah. So the distinction between them is that when a person who owns a Tam gores, he has to pay the half damages, but he pays it from the animal itself, meaning to say that there's a cap. That if your ox is worth $500 and it gores an ox that's worth $2,000, so you only pay half damages, only pay up to $1,000, but your ox is only worth $500, so that's your cap on what you could be liable for. That's in the case of a tam, he only pays half damages, and also it comes from the goof of the animal that does the goring, whereas the muad mishalem nezek shalem. Mishnah says a muad pays full damages, and min aliyah comes from the best of its property. If your ox had gored in the past, well, this ox you have to pay the full damages, and even if the ox doesn't cover the cost itself, you take it from the best of the property. But it doesn't list this case. It doesn't say the case of a kinas, the mode of a kinas is pater. It doesn't say case where a person admits it on his own that the owner of the ox will not pay. It doesn't say that since the tam is a kinas, it wouldn't pay on its own. So we see from here that the palganiska is mamona. You do pay on its own. Or the muad, you do pay on its own because it's mamona. So from the fact that it doesn't say that, we see from here that palganiska is mamona. Proof for Rav Papa against Rafuna Beredi Yeshua. So the Gemara says, no, we're not going to say that because Tana Vashir. The Tana wasn't all exhaustive. It wasn't completely listing all the differences between the tam and the muad. And so therefore, the fact that it doesn't list the palganiska is mimona like Rav Papa, that's just because it's shear. It left other stuff out. Well, the Gemara says, well, you have to tell me what else left out. My shear, the high shear. It would have had to left something else. The Gemara says, shear chatzi kofer. It lists out the case of a chatzi kofer. What is Rashi? What is this referring to? That if you have an ox that was a muad that killed a person, it pays kofer shoim. It pays the full ransom. And if it was a tam that killed a person, it does not even pay half ransom. That's what Rashi says. Shamur cheimis is adam mishalim kofer shoim. The muad pays full kofer, and a tam that kills a person, even a few chatzi kofer gedino b'nezikin lo mishalim. So he doesn't even pay half damages. So that's another distinction, that a muad pays the full kofer and the tam pays the half, doesn't even pay the half kofer. Gemara says, no, if that was the reason that we're saying that the tam doesn't even pay half kofer and the muad pays full kofer, that's not actually something that the Mishnah Baba Kama left out, because who is this Mishnah? Hamani Rabbi Yossi Aglili, because this position, our Mishnah is following the position of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says Tam Misham Chatzi Kofer. He says actually the Tam does pay the half ransom, and so therefore it's exactly like the Mishnah in Kesubos, which looks exactly like the Mishnah in Baba Kama, which says that the Tam Misham Chatzi Nezek. So this is another example. The Chatzi Kofer is exactly like Chatzi Nezek. And therefore, that's not a distinction. Gemara says, well, we'll still try to prove the case like Papa that Palganiska is Memona. We'll bring it from our Mishnah here in Babakam and Kesubos, where it states Tashma Hemis, where we stated Hemis Shori Es Ploni, where it states somebody says my ox killed so and so. O Shori Shaponi Hareza Mishayim Al Pi Atzmo. If a person says my ox killed somebody, then you're going to pay on your own admission. So my lab, why do we say you pay on your own admission? Aren't we talking about a tam? And even though you're paying half damages, it proves that half damages are memona, like our papa. Where says no, what we're talking about here is b'muad. That's why you're paying on your own admission, because it's a ox that scored before. So everybody says they pay the full compensatory damages because it's memona. Gemara says aval b'tam. So wait 1 second. If you're saying that, then if it will be an ox that gored for the first time, it would be a tam. My eno mishayim al piyas. You're saying it wouldn't pay on its own. But the problem with that is that the tani seifa. But the next clause states avdu shalponi eno mishayim al piyas. That if your ox gored an eved, it does not pay on its own admission. Niflog v'nisnei b'didei. If you wanted to bring in a case of a kinas, based upon your reading of the first clause, you should have said, when do we say the time that if your ox scores, that you pay on your own admission? B'muad, if it was an ox that was a muad. Aval tam, if it's a tam, then it would have brought the distinction of a tam, because the tam, according to Rav Huna Bar Rav Shua, is a knas, and it wouldn't pay. Mar says no, but moed kamari. The Mishnah prefers to just deal with the muad, and the muad is the first case here where it's an ox that gores as a muad, it pays full, and then in the next case where it's an ox that gores a slave, pays the 30 shekel. Mar says I'll bring you a fourth proof to say that like our Papa the Palganiska is Memona, because what does it say? It says in our Mishnah, Kol Meshalim Zaklau. This is the general rule. Kol Meshalim yes or Masha Izik Ein Meshalim Al Piasmo. And one who ends up paying more than the damage he did will not pay on the basis of his own admission. But if he ends up paying less than the damage that he did, that improves Mishayim Al Piatzmo. So if he ends up paying more than the damage he did, he does not pay on his own admission. That's a knas. But if he ends up paying less than the damage that he did, that he is Mishayim Al Piatzmo, which proves that if you pay less than the damage, that's Memona and not kinasa. That's a compensatory penalty and not a fine. Gemara says, no, don't read it. I say, don't read it if he pays less, he pays on his own admission. Read it, Ela Ema, that if he does it exactly like the damage he did, he pays on his own testimony. The Gemara says, but if it be less than the damage he did, would you say he does not pay on his own admission? Well, if that's the case, listening, then our Mishnah should have said, and then our Mishnah should have just said, this is the general rule. Whoever doesn't pay exactly like the compensatory damages he did, would not pay on the basis of his own admission. The mashma pachos and mashma yeser would imply less or more, even less is a knas, like Rav Huna bar Rav Yeshua. So from the fact that it doesn't say that, tiyuvta, from here we see that this is a refutation of Rav Huna bar Rav Yeshua and the laws like Rav Papa that palak niska is memona, that half damages are monetary. Mar says, but nevertheless, the halacha is palak niska is kinasa. Half damages is a fine, like Rav Huna bar Rav Yeshua. So Mar says, I don't understand. Tiyuvta ve'hochasa, you just said that Rav Huna bar Rav Yeshua is refuted, and now you're saying that halacha is like Rav Huna bar Rav Yeshua, that half damages is a fine. Gemara says, yes. Time amayis usif. Why was he refuted? Mishum delo katani kamasha hizik, because the Mishnah didn't give that proof that if the damages are exactly, that if the payment is exactly commensurate with the damages, that's memona and everything else is kanasa. Well, the reason why the Mishnah didn't give that example is lo psikale, is because it's not actually always true. Because kivan the ika chatzi nezek tzeroros, because since there is the case where half damages of tzeroros, where your pebbles kick off, and there we know that there where if the animal kicks off the pebbles while it's walking. There, we're saying that it's not exactly the damage that's caused because you pay half damages, but yet we have a tradition that's still considered memona and not a kanas, and it's compensatory and not a fine. And mishum hachi, for that reason, lo katani. Therefore, our Mishnah didn't want to list this general rule now that it's only memona if it's exactly the same amount. So the Gemara says, "V'hashas ta'amar." So now that we've established that palgan niska is kinas, so now that we've established that half damages are kinas, hi kalba da'achol imri. Let's say there's a dog that ate a sheep, v'shunra da'achol tarnagoli, or if there's a cat that ate a tarnagoli, a very large rooster. So this is an unusual act, mishunahu, and a tam will be exempt because it's just a kinas. But it's a kinas, so it's unusual. So therefore, you're liable for a kinas. But so we're not going to we're not going to allow them to collect it in Babel, because in Babylon the judges were not able to adjudicate cases of kinas. That was left only for places like the land of Israel, where the judges were mumchim, were experts, and they were ordained to get kinas. But if it be a small rooster, or chayu, that is actually typically what happens, and so therefore you would pay compensatory. Umakbinon, the itafas, and if this person grabbed the money that was owed to him, the itafas. So Rabbeinu Tam explains. And what we're referring to here is if you grabbed the nizak, this guy's rooster was eaten by the cat, the nizak grabs the cat itself. He grabs the cat itself. That's where the rabbis were lenient. He didn't just go into the guy's house and take his diamonds. He grabbed the actual thing that does the mazik. So he tafes that if he grabbed it, lo mafkin, he wouldn't take it away from him. And if also the Nizak says, make this guy meet me in a court in the land of Israel, where they do adjudicate kinas, we would make him go. And if he wouldn't go, we would excommunicate him. Gemara says, well, actually, either way, we're going to excommunicate the mazik, the one who does the damage. Because we told him you should have got rid of your damaging thing. Meet the Rabbi Nassan, the Tanya from what Rabbi Nassan taught. Rabbi Nassan Omer Minayin Shlo Yigdal Adam Kelav Rabasol. So how do we know a person is not allowed to raise a bad dog in their house. So how do we know a person is not able to put a shaky ladder in their house? As it states, you're not allowed to put blood in your house. And now we've finished. We have finished this glorious, beautiful third chapter of Maseches Kesubos. Be happy to answer any questions.